Hello, welcome to Shad Life. Why all of a sudden you hear people talking about front center a bunch? Well, there is a very specific reason for it. I feel like when it comes to geometry, it can get really complicated, and front center is just one of those things that is really difficult to understand. So I'm going to try to explain what it is, which is relatively easy, but not only that, but why is it important? Why does it matter? And that is where it gets a little harder to explain. So I'm going to try my best and a little video editing trickery that I hope works out here, and you'll see. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so what is front center? I have my mic, so hopefully the airplanes that fly over don't affect this video much. Front center, so we know chainstay length, center of bottom bracket to center of rear axle, that measurement. I'm not going to talk about numbers today because that's not the point of this video. But in this case, what is it, 425 chainstay, right? But it doesn't matter in this case. We're going to just basically talk about why it matters. So chainstay would be measure of center of bottom bracket to center of rear axle. Front center is measure of center of bottom bracket to center of front axle. And pretty much all bikes, the rear measurement, the chainstay length, and the front center measurement is going to be different, and the front center measurement is always going to be longer. So the idea here is when you're riding a bike, we want a good balance between the front and the rear wheel, and we have a contact patch. Well, that contact patch just happens to be directly underneath your axle, front and rear, when you're on level ground. Keep that in mind when you're on level ground. So that contact patch is going to be your wheelbase, right? So there's three numbers. There's chainstay length, front center, and wheelbase. Wheelbase is going to be slightly shorter than adding those two together. Well, why is that? Well, because your bottom bracket is actually down below the direct line between axles. So if you were to add your front axle to bottom bracket measurement, rear axle to bottom measurement together, and then do front axle directly to rear axle, that measurement's going to be slightly shorter just because the bottom bracket is down below that parallel line. It's called BB drop in the geometry charts. What's been happening lately and why this is being talked about a lot more is reach has been getting longer. Reach is center of bottom bracket straight up, and then the measurement to the center of your head tube on your frame, not your stacks here, the frame. So that is your reach measurement. That is the measurement that matters when you're standing on your bike and riding it. The measurement that matters when you're seated on the bike and riding it is effective top tube length. So those two numbers work together in kind of how the front end of the geometry, your cockpit, you might want to call it. Reach for standing, effective top tube for seated, right? So front center is being talked about a lot more recently because bikes keep getting longer, the reach keeps getting longer, and they get slacker. And what that does is that moves the front wheel out, the front axle, that way more. And then they keep getting shorter and shorter on the chainstay length, moving the back wheel in. Well, there gets to be a point where that's no longer going to be desirable because you won't be able to weight the front wheel very well if you have a long front center measurement and a super short rear end, because your weight is going to be more difficult to get centered on the bike. So I want to talk about that, about this weight distribution thing, because I think by talking about that and showing you physically on the bike, which is why I have it in the stand here, hopefully that'll make a little more sense to you at why this is important. Okay, I'm on the bike. I have the dropper down. So here it is in the up position, right? And if I'm gonna go ride some technical stuff, I'm gonna drop the seat down and get into the standing attack position, right? So right now, if I wanna weight the front wheel on flat surface, I wanna have my weight centered. I wanna be more forward and try to even my weight distribution. So if you draw a line straight down from roughly the center of where my center of mass or weight would be, it'd be a little forward of my hips here, and probably right in here somewhere on the frame. I'll draw a line for you here, and that's approximate, but I can kind of feel it. Like, I've been riding long enough to where I kind of know where I need to be to equally weight the wheels. Now, as the front end of the bike gets longer, I have to shift more and be more aggressive. You'll actually see this riding position that a lot of instructors talk about, where you're literally hinged forward like this and so on and so forth. But if you get your weight too far back, you're not going to weight the front wheel, and it'll slide out in turns and stuff. So when you're in turns, you really want to be in that centered position, and you can even push with your arms, things like that, to try to weight the tire. So you'll have the ideal weight in a turn is a 50-50 weight distribution between front and rear tires. You can actually learn where your body needs to be without ever measuring anything by going on some looser gravel or whatever. You don't even need to go that fast, and just standing and going around the corner until you slide or turning sharp. And if your front wheel starts to slide first, you're too far rear bias. If your rear wheel starts to slide first, you're too forward. If both wheels start to slide at the same time, then you have that ideal weight distribution. So what happens when the bike points down? So if I'm in this attack position and the bike starts to point down, I have to shift my weight back. Whoa, this is kind of sketchy. All right, whoa, all right. All right, well, I hope things in the garage didn't shift around when I did this, but so now I'm back pointing downhill. And why do I do this? Why do I shift my weight back? Well, now look at the line that I'm drawing between the center of my mass towards the ground. It is no longer perpendicular. It actually goes forward towards, guess what? The center of the bike, because that's what you want. I want to equalize the weight between my tires so I can go even further back if it gets steeper, right? And then as I level out, I gradually shift my weight back to normal, right? So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. So, like, when bikes are designed to point downhill, when downhill bikes or bikes that, like this bike that I've talked about in my reviews, is definitely designed for going fast downhill. So it's got a longer reach, slacker head angle, things like that. And so when I'm riding it, it feels pretty comfortable. When I'm on flat ground, though, I feel like I have to work more to weight the front wheel, because it's more designed to be pitched forward and not so designed to be riding flat. So basically, if you are mostly on flat terrain, mostly riding trails, like here in Minnesota is a perfect example. We do not have a whole lot of downhill. Sure, there's short sections of trail that are downhill and so on and so forth. There's a few exceptions. Duluth comes to mind, right? But for the most part, we're on pretty flat ground, and we're climbing, we're riding level flow trails. We might do some descending, things like that. So it's better to have a more well-balanced bike, like my Esker Hayduke, things like that, 66-degree head angle, more like a 420 for my height, right? 5'7", a 420 reach instead of a 440 reach, things like that. So is it more desirable to make a bike so downhill specific? Maybe if that's all you do, but if you do a lot of mixed riding, then now that bike becomes too single purpose. So front center is actually a very important measurement to consider when buying a bike. Reach, head tube angle, front center, all this stuff where the bikes keep getting longer. They're adding longer front center, thus making it harder to weight the front wheel when the bike is on level ground and when it's climbing. So you kind of want a good, well-balanced bike for the kind of terrain that you're riding. So as mountain bike riding has progressed, there's more flow trail, more technical trail, things like that. So have bikes. And one of the biggest things that have changed over the years is the front end. The front end has gotten longer, the stems have gotten shorter, things like that. It's all about getting the front wheel further out there so you're not front end heavy and have too much weight on the front wheel and not enough on the rear, especially in the case when the bike does point down. So if you think of old mountain bikes where you had shorter frames and we had these long stems on them, trust me, I've been riding mountain bikes for a long time, since the late 80s, throughout the 90s and stuff. And this long stem always made the bike sketchy, because whenever I was standing on the bike riding and I stood up and leaned forward, the front wheel was tucked back underneath. And so as soon as the bike pitched over, all my weight's forward. And then I would have to lean back like I showed you, but I could never lean back far enough to make it not feel super sketchy. And yes, there were times I went over the bars because of that. And then as soon as we started adding suspension, it even got worse, because what would happen is you'd have all of that weight over the front end and the handlebars, and then your suspension would compress and make the bike dive, and just nothing was going in the right direction. So mountain bikes have evolved the way they are today for very valid reasons, and it's because we want to feel safer and be able to pitch the bike down over stuff, even if you're just going over a log pile or rock or some kind of feature on a trail. You know, you want the bike to not easily endo, not easily flip. Going off jumps. As long as you're good at like making sure you pull up the front end, and as you come off, you'll be good. The bike's gonna nice and stable level out. On these bikes where your weight was all way over the front wheel, if you went off jumps, you couldn't, like, you could pull up really hard, but your weight was too far forward and you'd still endo. You'd have to pull up twice as hard, 3 times as hard on the handlebars going off jumps just to keep the front end of the bike up. So it was pretty sketchy back then. And now we're kind of getting to that point where I feel like, and I've said this a lot on my channel, I feel like we've hit the sweet spot. When you hear me talk about riding my Esker Hayduke and stuff, I always talk about this is the sweet spot. 66-degree head angle. For me, like a 420-ish reach, stuff like that. My Rustler's also right in there, same kind of numbers. To me, it's kind of the sweet spot where it's a really good all-around bike that can do everything, and so on and so forth. And when we start getting to bikes like this, now they start becoming more single purpose. Much longer front end, slacker head angle, things like that. And even more so now that I have this in the MX configuration with a 29-inch front wheel and a 27.5 rear, that even slackens it out more, and so on and so forth. So that pretty much covers what's important about front center and why you're hearing it talked about a lot. So pay attention to that, this what's going on here now. We've always been talking a lot about the rear end, your chainstay length, things like that. But having the shortest chainstay, especially on these long slack bikes, isn't necessarily the most desirable thing, because then it's going to be that much harder to get that equalized weight balance, because you're going to move this point in, you're going to move that point out. Meanwhile, you're still back here, so you got to shift your weight even more forward to weight the front wheel. So, cool. That was not me just losing my balance there for a second because of this nice uneven yard. Cool. I hope that helps explain it some and gives you a better understanding, especially my little tilt thing I just did there with some lines. But yeah, cool. Let me know what you think in the comments. I appreciate your support for my channel. Please like and subscribe. Peace.